And as I was saying, it was pretty straightforward what Rucker et al. Found. That is, the angrier people get, the more they want to punish. And you know, it's not earth-shattering, but it was the first time it was ever demonstrated within that paradigm. So it's publishable. It adds to the empirical knowledge, which is what we're after. Now, sometimes, though, findings are what they call counterintuitive. That is, it's not what we would expect based on our experience in real life. And in this case, let's talk about juries and let's talk about the courtroom. Let's suppose a piece of evidence that was illegally obtained is presented in court and the attorney objects, and then the judge says, well, you know what, that piece of evidence shouldn't be allowed. So I want the jury to forget that they heard that. Take that out of your decision making. Well, the big question is, can jurors do that? And mock jury trial evidence, empirical testing shows no, jurors can't factor it out. The funny thing is, they can't factor it out of their decision-making process, but if we ask them, did that piece of information influence your decision? They say no, because we were told to factor it out. So here, jurors don't have access to their own process, and this is a surprising finding, and this becomes an important finding. And this is what Marilyn, my advisor, would have called it, you know, kind of a sexier finding, because in fact, it's counterintuitive. So let's take a short trip down memory lane. Let's talk about Norman Triplett. We're going to go to the 1890s when we're talking about bicycles and bicycle racing, and bicycles were a primary mode of transportation at that point in time. What Triplett observed in the real world, and this is how much research starts, wow, I see something in the real world and it makes me wonder, I question it, and I have a couple assignments coming up at you guys where you're going to be field studying, so to speak, making observations in the real world. So Triplett observed that bicycle racers, when they're racing in competition against each other, would post faster times than the same bicycle riders racing against the clock alone. So he said, wow, that seems strange that, you know, the times would vary to that extent. So he brought it into the laboratory. And he brought boys into the laboratory. And he'd give a boy in the first condition a fishing reel. And it's got about 100 feet of line. And they'd pull the line out and they'd say, okay, reel it in as fast as you can. And we're going to time how quickly you do it. And then they would do that like 20 different boys, and they would average the times. Remember, we average the results of multiple participants, and they would hold on to that average, and then they would take two different boys, and put them in the laboratory and have them do the same thing, but racing against each other instead of the clock. So 2 fishing reels, 2 sets of line, and what happens is the boys invariably did it more quickly when they were racing against each other on average. So now we have the average of the individual versus the average of 2 individuals in competition, and we see that they post faster times. What this did was then support Triplett's notion that competition between people generated faster times. And that's how you add to the body of knowledge. Okay? Now, William James wrote Principles of Psychology, 1890s, huge book, 2-volume work. And James was a social psychologist primarily. Let's look at something that he's talked about in emotion that really kind of flipped the notion of how emotion works, flipped it right on its head. So he said, common sense says, we lose our fortune, are sorry and we weep. We meet a bear, we're frightened, we run. We're insulted by a rival, are angry and we strike. The hypothesis here to be defended says that this order sequence is incorrect. So James is saying, no, that's not the way it works. At least I don't believe it. We feel sorry because we cry. We feel angry because we strike. We feel afraid because we tremble. And look at the impact of what James is offering us. He's saying, I see a bear, I start running, and then in fact I feel the emotion fear as a result of that behavior. So he's putting emotion as the result of behavior, almost as an explanation of stimulus, behavior, explanation of what happened in terms of emotion. Classic theory to be tested over and over again. And what do we find in the laboratory? Sometimes it actually works that way. Other times it doesn't. So things aren't necessarily all that simple. Floyd Allport is really telling us, bring this stuff into the laboratory, test it, test these interactions between the individual and the situation, but use the experimental method and use highly refined experimental control, random assignment to limit alternative explanations. So, when did social psychology kind of really take off and gain some steam? It was up to and after World War II. Up to World War II, we're still stinging from World War I, that European war that we sent American lives over to fight. We lost all these American lives in World War I. And here it is, what, 20 years later, less than 20 years, World War II has begun. And the Americans are like, no way. That's a European war. Let them duke it out. That is their problem. That is their frickin' issue. Let us not deal with that. You know, so we're going to be isolationist. Well, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, is like, nah, that's not going to work. We're going to have to get involved, but the people don't want to do it. How am I going to manage this? Well, we have to ready the troops and the American people for the eventuality. One thing we do initially then is study the attitudes of people. So Carl Hovland and what was called the Yale group of persuasion researchers, attitude researchers at Yale, started looking at this. They produced a series of short documentary propaganda films, if you will, why we should fight. I think there was 7 in all. But they're assessing American attitudes during the war. And upon assessing attitudes, then you determine ways that you might persuade Americans to support the war. And then you remeasure attitudes to see if the persuasion worked. That's kind of how the system works. Now, one of the things that was issue a year or 2 years into the war was we're running out of money as a country. That is, this is an expensive war already. We've been backing the Soviet Union. We've been backing Great Britain. We've been backing China. We've been spending a huge amount of American money on helping these countries with their war effort against the Axis, against the Nazis. And we need money. They decide we'll sell war bonds. So that is, you invest your money in these war bonds and then they'll pay interest back to you after the war. How do you persuade people to do that? Well, you use iconic images, right? Where's our iconic image of raising the flag on Iwo Jima? And you say, we got to do more of this. We need your money. The Marines need your money, right? So it was the persuasion. Social psychology, cognitive psychology is heavily involved in training techniques and developing better training techniques. And to this day, the military is one of the chief consumers of psychological theory and psychological testing in terms of developing better and better training programs. So we also have this issue that we have to man the factories, but much of our workforce is now left to fight the war. So how do we convince women that their place is now driving buses, working in factories, operating the infrastructure because so many men are gone? So we persuade women, yes, we can. We have Rosie the Riveter, iconic image, saying, hey, you can do it. And then the war ends. And if you want to know how it turned out, yeah, we won. Right? We beat down the Nazis. Who would ever think we'd be fighting that battle again? But that's an aside, right? But now we have all the American men coming back and they need their jobs. So now we have to persuade the women, no, your place is, no, you shouldn't be in the factory. You should be at home, making babies, working in the kitchen, cleaning the house. So we shift women's perspective or try to persuade them of the new right thing to do. And of course, in the 1960s and 1970s, we see this start to reverse with the women's liberation movement. But I think one of the biggest impacts for social psychologists was looking at what we discovered, the work of the Nazis when it was all said and done. The operation of concentration camps and extermination camps, killing people based on their group membership. 6 million, 7 million, 8 million people killed in a very systematic fashion, a factory-like fashion. How do you get people to operate these factories, these death factories? This is unbelievable obedience when you take someone who was a butcher, a baker, or a candlestick maker, and today, and a couple weeks later, what are they doing? They're rounding up minority group members and sending them to their death. How do you get people to do that? And social psychology had to spend a lot of time attempting to understand and explain this. If the name Stanley Milgram rings a bell, we'll talk about Milgram, and he's one of the ones that studied obedience very effectively. So, in all, World War II was a tremendous boost in social psychology when it was all said and done. So social psychology, what's it doing in the last 50 years, 60 years? Well, behaviorism has been somewhat embraced by social psychology, a greater look at the situationalism that is implied in behaviorism, manipulation of reward and punishment, that is the manipulation of the situation and its effect on behavior. So we see, I think, a greater integration of behaviorism and social psychology. The cognitive revolution that grew out of man's relationship, I believe, with computers, right, and trying to explain then psychological process in terms of hardware and software integrated to produce outcomes, predictable outcomes, was in part the basis of the cognitive revolution that took place starting in the 60s going through the 80s. In the 80s, early 80s to mid 80s, social psychologists started to become interested in processes that appeared to happen automatically, and they said that the source of these automatic processes is the unconscious. A little uncomfortable with the word unconscious because Sigmund Freud was all about the unconscious, and Sigmund Freud has been largely poo-pooed, you know, because he wasn't empirically supported. So this new generation of social psychologists, Ullman, Barge wrote the book The New Unconscious in the early 80s, right? It was looking at the effects of the unconscious and how the unconscious is affected by the situation. Many of us have abandoned the word unconscious and used the word non-conscious, and it severs our kind of relationship to Sigmund Freud in that regard. The return of motivation. The cognitive revolution really brought the death of motivation because motivation was never effectively demonstrated in the laboratory. Anytime someone tried to say, well, look, here's some motivation, the cognitive psychologists just explain it, no, that's just a cognitive process. It doesn't represent any kind of motivation. Is your computer motivated? And you say, well, no, and well, neither are human beings, right? So we can explain it in terms of the software that they're running. But 1990, 1991, Ziva Kunda came along and said, no, motivation exists, and it's only a matter of time before some clever social psychologists, in fact, demonstrate that it does in the laboratory. And Pete Ditto was one of the first to do that. My advisor at University of California, Irvine, conducted a series of studies and published several articles about motivation. So firmly put motivation back in the realm of social psychology. Social psychology has been working hard to reconcile since the 1980s emotion and cognition. What are they? How are they the same? How are they different? What is their relationship to each other? And that's ongoing work, and that's absolutely fascinating work. Social cognitive neuroscience is like the bomb now. Neuroscience, right? We've got an fMRI machine in the basement of psychology at Ohio State. And this was very forward-looking. When they built that building and they designed that basement, they were ready to go. The fMRI machine came a little later, but I really think this is the future. The current future right now is kind of social cognitive neuroscience, understanding the brain's relationship to behavior. Behavioral genetics is another huge new area, and how do genetics affect behaviors is a fascinating area. And look how much we're learning about genetics. How many of you have, perhaps sent your DNA to 23andMe and discovering things about yourself in that regard? Huge area. And evolutionary psychology is a wonderful, refreshing point of view of, we ask the question when we observe processes, mental processes, when we observe behaviors, we can ask, well, how is this adaptive? And remember, Darwin never said survival of the fittest. Darwin said survival of the adaptive. And so how do we adapt? And if that question interests you, you might want to take psychology of adjustment. I teach it in the fall typically. And well, by now, I'm a shameless self-promoter, right? So I will promote all the different classes I teach, and I hope to see you in those. And that's one of the beauties of teaching this course, because it's like a gateway course, a gateway to advanced studies in psychology. Finally, let's wrap this up, right? Social psychology is becoming increasingly concerned with not just to know what will happen, but with also, does it happen to all types of people in the same way? So it opens a door to moderating variables, personality variables, if you will. When does it happen and when does it not happen? So this is what Phil Tetlock, my advisor, used to call boundary conditions. And we would make something happen in the lab, and he'd say, yeah, but can you then make the opposite happen in the laboratory as well? And what's the condition that you manipulated to make it go this way or that way? So the discovery and exploration of boundary conditions. But I think the gold standard, really, if you want to publish in social psychology in this day and age, you've got to demonstrate the why behind it, the why and the how. And this is, instead of moderation, which I was talking about at the beginning there, it's mediation. That is, it's more process-based. So in all, social psychology, fascinating science. It's irresistible to those of us who have stumbled onto it and continue to work in it. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the semester with you guys. I know this is a 6-week semester, and we call it a semester. It's going to be intense. I hope you guys enjoy it as much as I'm going to enjoy sharing social psychology with you.